Hey everyone, my name is Eric Vento. This is another podcast of Government to Private, where we talk about the transition stories of people who are coming out of the government, whether you're in military, the law enforcement, the intelligence community, or any other aspect of government. Today, we're privileged to have Monique Rollin here with us. She worked 30 plus years in law enforcement in the government of Canada, and we are so privileged to have her with us today and to hear her story. Monique, thank you for joining us.
Good morning, Eric. It's my pleasure. Happy to be here and maybe share my story.
Absolutely. Well, we're excited to hear your story. And as you know, whatever your opinion of your own story is, I know it's going to help at least one person, because even though our own journeys are so unique, you know, there's enough similarities between those of us who work in law enforcement, whether it's in the US, Canada, or another country, where we instantly just really empathize. We really connect with each of our stories. And so I have no doubt that yours is going to be no different. So let's go ahead and jump in. Can you tell us about your career and where you served?
So I was a police officer for the same municipal police service for just under 32 years. It's a small service in what we call Northern Ontario, but it's actually on the US border. So a small service, 140 members. But what was a little different with my service is that we are geographically isolated. So there aren't big cities around us. I think that, it's Canada, so nothing is around us. So the next big city, 3.5 hours away one way, 8 hours the other way. So coming from a service like that, you wear a lot of hats and you become good at a lot of things, or you have to be. So I had that privilege and moved up into the command ranks, being the first woman to make senior command. So, you know, in the history of 150 years of my service, that was groundbreaking in a way, and allowed me to, work in leadership and command, working in a lot of different areas as a division commander before I retired.
I love that. What was it like being the first woman in an executive leadership role?
It was tougher than I thought. And it was that politicized competitive environment with my peers that I didn't anticipate having to deal with on a regular basis. So that was the most difficult part. It certainly wasn't the folks that I worked with and the people who had, positions within my area at all.
Awesome. Yeah, that's good to hear. So what are some of the highlights of your career that you can tell us about?
I worked in mostly investigations for most of my career. So being a detective was the majority of my career. So I worked in domestic violence. I worked in what we call morality back there, which was street crimes, and a lot of abuse crimes against children. So a lot of the fulfilling work was working with vulnerable victims, and right up into major crimes. And so having those, hard-working cases that led to success, and then still working with victims of intimate partner violence right up until the end of my career. And now still working on consulting projects and volunteering with my local shelter. So, all of that translated into really fulfilling work for sure.
That's awesome. 30 plus years. That's definitely a career to be proud of for sure. So when did you start thinking about getting out of law enforcement?
It was at almost 32 years. So we can retire in my service in this province at about 30 years service. And so there was some, I was looking at competing for a higher level position, and looking at, retirement, but I was, too young in my mind to just stop working. So it was time within my own organization for me to go, but it wasn't time for me to stop working.
Understood. And how did you kind of prepare yourself both physically and mentally for that transition?
I didn't. And so what I sort of fell into maybe leveraging those friends and relationships that I had, because I was involved with a lot of committees, at the senior command level throughout the province and in the country, a lot of projects internationally as well. And so I started reaching out to those contacts who were successful because I just didn't know where I was going to land. I knew that I've been working since I was 15 years old. How do you stop after 35 plus years? And just trying to find my way. I knew I had some skills that I could bring to the table. I just had no idea how. And through some conversations, landed some really fulfilling work, and had a colleague that I had done some training for who reached out to me to help his business, and it went from there.
Awesome. So you utilize existing relationships and ones that you created to really inform your progress.
I did, and I did it without a plan. So here I am.
Hey, I love that. I mean, like I said, it definitely works. And I really appreciate hearing that because, a lot of people get so discouraged when they're like, well, I don't know who to reach out to. I don't know what to do. There's no guidebook, there's no roadmap. And so, you utilize the power of relationships, both existing as well as new, to really build your path. And ultimately, that's what it's all about.
I did. And I had a great friend, and I still have a great friend who is sort of the hub of all things connection. And he's a wonderful person, and is former law enforcement. And he kind of took me under his wing and recommended a fantastic book, which is Victory Lap Retirement, which sort of changed my perspective because we have a very small idea about what we're good at, I think, when we come from government or policing. So you might be pretty good at what you do or successful in your own little job, but there's hundreds of people like you who are also really good at what they do. So I think we diminish our capabilities. I think we don't see ourselves, or we diminish our own value. I certainly did. And I don't really understand that amazing skill set that we've developed, become successful in our own organizations, translates to the rest of the world. And so I just needed that cheerleader in the background to give me that push, and did some really good reading and talked to some other folks who were very successful, and realized, well, wait a minute, I do have something, and I know I'm a good trainer, and I'm a good training developer, and I'm good at, give me a problem and I'll fix it. Well, that's what business outside of government really is identifying those gaps and those problems and bringing whatever you have to the table, and it works. I just don't think we have that lens when we're close to retirement to realize what we bring to the table.
Yeah, I think, you raise a really good point that we talk about pretty frequently, in that, when you're in law enforcement, especially for a number of years, you get used to doing things from a law enforcement perspective and lens. And it's really, really difficult to compare that to the corporate world because you have no experience in the corporate world. I tell people all the time, you don't know what you don't know. Like it's so many times I have these conversations and I'm like, okay, well, if you've overseen a shooting scene or you've overseen a major incident, that's crisis management or business continuity or emergency management in the corporate world. It's the exact same thing. It's just a different
Yes.
level of authority, and people are like, you see the light bulb go off. They're like,
Yes.
oh, and
Yes.
it's just because they've been talking in one language, but the corporate world is talking in another, and no one's ever shown them how to merge the two together.
And no one's grown up learning that skill set in the corporate world. So we, by just experience and training and leadership, start to develop those skills, and they become, second nature to us. And there are a lot of people like us. But when we transfer to private sector, they just don't exist. Those folks haven't grown up having to learn that skill set and be really good at it. And so what I have found is that towards the end of my career, I felt like I had to fight for a seat at the table. There's a lot of other dynamics and agendas that go on, especially in policing. I think we're worse to each other than we are to anyone else. And so that feeling of not having the same value or being messaged that, as well as having to fight for a seat at the table, whether it be your skill set, your gender, the agenda of other folks, whatever it was, disappears. And so I've said to lots of women, majority of women that I've mentored and other folks, is that what a different feeling when you are invited to the table, appreciated for the skill set that you bring to the table, have all kinds of ideas that are actually listened to at that table, and they want to pay you for your expertise,
Right.
for what you bring. They actually see value in it and appreciate that value. And I think we undervalue ourselves, of course, but they see a financial investment in the value that you bring to that table. And we come from a world where it's just the opposite. And so it's changing your mindset and it's listening to others. I certainly undervalued my work at the beginning and didn't have the self-confidence to charge maybe enough dollars. I mean, I'm conscious of, my customers' budgets, of course, but and working, and listening to other folks that are very successful and some great leaders, I had to learn my way, and also really having to learn that I didn't need anyone else to work with, that I was just fine being an autonomous business.
That's definitely a good lesson for me as well. I know that you're really, really passionate about assisting women, not only from a law enforcement perspective, but from other perspectives as well. Can you give us a little bit of an overview of what you're involved in right now?
Well, the majority of the work that I do is actually training for police. So I work with a lot of small services throughout the country. And I train critical incident commanders, crisis negotiators, frontline supervisors, 911 professionals, and all things critical incident command and critical incident response. So that's, sort of the training aspect. And then from there, it's morphed into working with fire marshal's office, working with independent companies who see that skill set will transfer. And I also do a lot of consulting. So that's sort of business continuity work, taking a look at training and systems and then building those programs. But in the background, I am running into other women who are phenomenally skilled and who are looking to do something like I'm doing. So take those skill sets and moving on. And I know one of the biggest things that I needed was just that cheerleader in the background who says, don't doubt yourself. Look what you're bringing to the table. Let me introduce you to the right people and sort of push you in that direction. Because if I can do it, anybody can do it. Because I'm certainly nobody special when it came to jumping into it. I'm just like everyone else. And I had the right people in my corner. So I just want to be that person in their corner.
Yeah, I don't think there's anything more to be said on that. I mean, that's a really, really great response. And, there's a lot of women who, reach out to me on a consistent basis to talk about the transition, who watch these podcasts. And so, based upon your 30 plus years in law enforcement and everything that you've done, since working for that municipality, what are some pieces of advice that you would give to women who are considering either transitioning out of law enforcement or another aspect of the government?
I'm going to say leverage those relationships. So I don't think we realize the contacts and relationships that we have. So telling your story to your friends and colleagues who are either private sector or who have been successful and moved on, telling them their story, which I did. And somebody said to me, you should meet this person. And I do it all the time. Oh, I know someone who is doing that kind of work. Or if somebody reaches out to me, I'll say, I know a person. It's not my wheelhouse, but I know a person. So one is start to leverage those relationships and have those conversations and listening to that advice. I did get some really bad advice from, a coach when I was going into the private sector, who told me that I should just focus on one thing. And I did not take that advice. And now I'm successful at a whole bunch of things. And I'm really passionate about a lot of things. And so if somebody comes to you and says, hey, do you think you could do this? If you've never done it before, maybe your reaction because of self-confidence might be, oh, I don't know. I don't know if I can do that. I've never done it before. Instead of saying, hey, that sounds really cool. I have all of these skills in my pocket. Yeah, I could do that. Or yeah, for sure. Which was a barrier I had made for myself. And that's the advice I give to particularly women, because we get different messaging throughout our career about having to work a little bit more harder, about not being recognized. It is still a very paramilitary, male-dominated profession. And so there are barriers there, and they're systemic and they're inherent, that we face all the time. And so we have to sort of change our mindset. And my advice is take those chances and stop undervaluing yourself. And of course you can do it, because if somebody handed you a problem in your work environment, your current work environment, what would you do if you've never done it before? I would just figure it out and do it. Well, it's the same. I was born with that. How hard could it be, gene? And so, and probably sometimes it's not always worked out, but if somebody says to me, can you do this? And I'm like, how hard could it be? I'll figure it out. I'll do the research. I'll talk to the people that do it well. I'll read, I'll confer. I don't have that ego at the table. I'll say, I've never done this before, but yeah, I'll give it to me. And I think that a lot of my female colleagues are those people that just get it done. And if you are the get it done, how hard could it be person, you will be 100% successful, because you're not limited by your own fears. You just can't be.
Someone, absolutely. I mean, I'm kind of just walking down my own memory lane, as you're talking about this. And, if someone had asked me when I came out of law enforcement whether I'd be doing what I would be doing now, I'd be like, no, I don't have any experience doing that. But, the role that I'm in now, they literally just said, well, we don't have this functionality. We want this functionality. So instead of hiring for it, are you interested in learning about it and just building it for us? And so took me way out of my comfort zone and forced me to really, consider some of the, are you good enough, feelings that I had, in the imposter syndrome and stuff like that. And so really, really identify with what you just said. And it's just, again, just had a little walk down memory lane.
Well, you know what it's like in law enforcement. They transfer us into some job that you've never even heard of, you've never done before, all the time. We know how it works. You have this level of seniority and there's an opening over there. You're filling it, whether you have experience in that work or not. So we fly by the seat of our pants all the time. So what do? If you want to be successful, you research, you learn, you talk to the people who've done it before, you make mistakes, you get up. That's how law enforcement teaches us to be good problem solvers. So when I tell these folks who are maybe struggling with making those big steps, you do this all the time. And like, I'm not afraid of making mistakes. I'm my worst critic. Aren't we all? My worst. I'm harder. No one is harder on me than me. No one can ever be. And so, and we all don't want to do anything unless we know we're already good at it. So it's very intimidating to make those steps. But I'm going to say, how many of us have that? How hard could it be, Jean? Or I'll figure it out when I'm there.
Absolutely. And one thing you said earlier about, so many times when people are coming out, they're like, well, I'm really good at investigations. I'm really good at this. And so I think I'm just going to stay in that area. And I'm always quick to say, well, just know that the corporate sector, whether you're talking about corporate security or outside of it, is massive. And so widen your aperture, widen what you're looking for, because you could easily find a job that you just love, that you have a good boss in, that you work within a good culture that really isn't within the overall corporate security umbrella, and that's been my story. That's been a lot of other people's stories as well. And I think what people don't realize is that there's a whole other world out here that is so much bigger than law enforcement. And has so many different areas of expertise, but all of the skills, for the most part, obviously there are exceptions, but for all the skills that you have in law enforcement, they're directly correlatable to the skills in the private sector. They're just called something different, and as soon as you're able to articulate that both on paper as well as in an interview setting, then you're like, well, I've managed a program in law enforcement. I could be a program manager. Oh, I've managed projects. I could be a project manager. I've done this. I could do this. And so once you either have someone tell you that, or you do the research on your own and you figure this stuff out, the concept of potentially going out of law enforcement, at least in my mind and those of the people I've talked to, becomes a lot less overwhelming.
Agreed. And I really stayed in the law enforcement world, and because I saw so many gaps. And so when I started, traditionally, I started with some of the traditional training, crisis negotiators, for example. And I've been doing that. I've been a negotiator since like the late 90s and training negotiators. But what I found in my own service and others, for this is an example, is that we do the disservice of not training the people who negotiate with folks in crisis the most, which are 911 communicators. And so I started within my own service and later on training them in what back then was not the buzzword of crisis de-escalation, which was training our first responders in responding to critical incidents. So being part of the critical incident team. Look, they're going to save every SWAT officer's butt in the long run if you include them. So doing that, and then realizing, they need also formalized training because we expect them to be negotiators and they're not. And I knew that gap existed, and I looked, and that training really didn't exist in this country. And it certainly wasn't being picked up by the academies and those sorts of institutions. And so that has flourished for me. And all I did was take my incident commander, tactical commander, and crisis negotiator experience and appreciate the gap that these first responders were facing. And it's, without marketing, has been very successful. And I love it. I'm very passionate about it, passionate about these folks. And so, and that's transferred into a lot of work within law enforcement, including some of those other things, and working with things like critical incident scribes, and now it's into fire and emergency management. And so it's all, as long as you don't limit yourself, it's hard. There's no end in sight, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. And I really identify with you identifying a gap within, critical incident management and saying, hey, we're not training a critical subset of the people who are making these life and death decisions or having life and death communications.
We're not giving them that validation, and we're not giving them the training, because I came from debriefs where we all know in critical incident, communication is always the problem, always, not communicators. But how do we, if we know this, why aren't we doing more about it? And there's not a police agency that I've been involved in who doesn't agree with me. So that's an identifiable gap. And I love the training. I have a background in it. Why wouldn't I capitalize on it? And it really wasn't for me. It was more of a passion and a love for it than it was like a marketing plan. I didn't have to advertise.
Well, I mean, honestly, that's how a lot of the really, really good ideas that turn into businesses start.
Yes.
Is, you're taking your subject matter expertise and you're saying, okay, now that I've analyzed my experiences and how most people approach, processes and playbooks and SOPs, this is a gap that I want to focus on that I know needs further work, doesn't have enough resources, et cetera. And then that passion project, if you will, that you start just flourishes,
right?
Because you're not someone just coming in and saying, hey guys, you need help with this. You're coming in and saying, I've been where you are, I've walked in your shoes, and I know that you need help, and I'm here to help you fill that gap.
And I have to rely on those other experts. So, I'll get my material vetted through forensic psychologists and social folks and experienced tactical folks, all of those things. I certainly don't have the ego to think that I have the answer, but I'm a really good problem solver. And even in my consulting business, when somebody sits down with a lens from outside your organization and looks at it, it's not my opinion, it's that whole list of consultation and bringing all the right people to the table and giving them a voice and then presenting back what you see as the gaps. That isn't me. It's just I have developed the process and I'll work with the right people and bring it forward. So you don't have to, because we all know everybody's desk is full.
Absolutely. So now that you've looked back on the transition process and, you know, your journey since then, what are some of the things you wish you would have known?
I wish would have been more secure with my own abilities and not partnered with anyone else. And not that that was a bad experience. It's just that I prefer autonomy in decision making, and not everybody's vision is the same. And so I think I would have gone alone, and like I am now, with a really cool cast of characters. And so I would have reached out to all of these great experts in my life and say, hey, can I rely on you when I need you? And I have this wonderful group of associates now to say, somebody's given me this project. It's not my wheelhouse. Do you want to come in on it? Instead of, sort of handcuffing myself to one idea. So find your cast of characters, those experts, those supporters, those friends that you've met along the way, and keep them in your pocket, because not only they're going to reach out to help you when you need them, they are those people who you can bounce ideas off or lend their expertise to. And so I'm very fortunate to have some wonderful people in my life who are not only cheerleaders, but they are my sort of cast of experts.
I love that. I just, you know, that I really identify with that, because that's what I talk about all day, every day, is utilizing relationships. So as we wrap up the podcast, is there any other advice or any other information that you feel that maybe a younger you or that someone else who is in your position would have liked to have known?
Read the book, Victory Lap Retirement. Talk to those people who are around you, and don't be afraid to ask for help. And really learn from those, because we're all going to stumble, but learn from those mistakes early. I think we tend to be timid when we take the leap, and find yourself a cheerleader.
Love it. Words to live by. Well, thank you so much, Monique, for joining us this morning. And I really, really appreciate your words of wisdom and your unique perspective.
Thank you. Always happy to contribute, even from the cottage.
Sounds good. Thanks so much.
Have a great day.
You too. Bye.